The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The Case of the Berlin Conference by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Bryan Godwin. In fall of 1884, I accompanied Holmes on a mission on behalf of the British government, which led us to Germany. On November 15th of the same year, the International Congo Conference, where the major leaders were conferring about their respective interests on the African continent. However, after the unpleasant experiences of our secret mission in Brussels a few months earlier, I had serious concerns about this undertaking. After all, at that time we had only barely escaped the fate of eking out a miserable existence in a Belgian prison for the rest of our lives. But Holmes stuck to his path, especially since he did not want to admit any defeat towards his brother Mycroft. Although Holmes had given me the okay to stay in safe London, it goes without saying that I didn't want to let my friend go on this journey all alone. Roughly speaking, our assignment was to support the British delegation. After all, as we had experienced beforehand, some foreign powers would resort to anything, including criminal and espionage, in order to thwart the intentions of the United Kingdom. With that in mind, our task was to stay in the background so we could uncover any possible acts of sabotage and to prevent potential conspiracies. At the same time, however, formal diplomatic decency had to be maintained, which is why we officially acted as strategic political advisors to our head of delegation. Incidentally, we knew him all too well. It was Mr. Edward Mallet, now the British ambassador to Berlin, who had worked in the same position in Brussels beforehand. We got to know him during the events that were just mentioned earlier. Of course, we were again incognito. Due to the sufficient preparation time, Holmes had grown a professorial beard and blinked through a pair of round glasses, while I smoothly shaved off my beard, still wearing sideburns. In East London, we boarded our ship, the HMS Doggerbank, and our diplomatic passports listed me as Baron Linfield and Holmes as the bourgeois scholar and African explorer George Dalton. In order to avoid the Belgian territory, we had decided against the direct crossing of the English Channel, and instead accepted the longer passage over the southern North Sea to Hamburg. The trip was largely uneventful. This time, I had provided Holmes with a sufficiently tried and tested remedy for seasickness, which made itself possible for my friend to stay below deck and to delve into colonial papers for preparation. For my part, I spent a lot of time at the bow of the ship, looking forward and defying the rough seas that hurled wind gusts and salt water towards me, accompanied by the unfriendly November cold. The knowledge of being on the road on behalf of the Empire, for Her Majesty the Queen and Fatherland, animated me with a peculiar patriotic pride that made me forget about the dangers of this enterprise. So I was willing to face the cunning enemies of the Crown, the French, the Germans, the Russians, the Belgians, the Dutch, and the Americans bravely. I decided to resist them like the front of our ship resists the violent waves. The direct course to the Elbe Strand was steadily on the east-southeast. Less than 100 nautical miles off the German coast, we passed the island of Helgoland. Since the Napoleonic Wars, this peculiar island, together with its relatively small population, has been under British administration and has been a permanent issue between the United Kingdom and the Germans. The German claims, however, were not entirely unjustified in my opinion, and even the North Frisian locals themselves, though they did not quite know whether they actually wanted to regard themselves as Germans, were linked to mythological ancient Germanic ideas, which were further promoted by nationalism and the founding of the Reich. Soon we reached the funnel-shaped delta of the Elbe. We passed Cuxhaven on the southern coast and entered the river mouth, which due to its depth made it possible to ship onto the outskirts of Hamburg. So, although strictly speaking a river port, The imposing facility had taken on a considerable extent and was, ironically, Germany's largest and most important seaport, both for freight transport and travelers. Here, countless merchant ships with goods from all continents docked every day. One could even board a passenger ship that would take you directly to New York, Buenos Aires, or Yokohama. Although, of course, not comparable to Liverpool, Hamburg was obviously Germany's main gateway to the world. Only the Imperial Navy preferred the bases Wilhelmshaven and Kiel. During the landing, I disappeared just below deck to induct my adjutant, Mr. Dalton, to get our luggage out of the cabin and upstairs. And as the English aristocrat I aimed to be, I did not consider it beneath me to hold the door open for the commoner myself. In passing, however, Holmes muttered something about noble privileges, revolution, and free civil rights. I also thought I had heard the word guillotine, which Holmes later vehemently denied. Anyway, on deck the sailors took our suitcases and brought them off board. At the dock there was a cart, which a skilled North German dock worker pulled for us without too much effort in the direction of Berliner Bahnhof, which was located in the immediate vicinity of the upper harbor. The direct train from Hamburg to Berlin, which are the largest German cities, if one does not include the Austrian Vienna, existed since 1846 and was a prestige project of the Prussian State Railways. Accordingly, it had been built in several stages, and the fastest locomotives were used on this route. Thus, the journey from the German gateway to the political center of power of the German Reich took only 4.5 hours, in which the approximately 180 miles were covered. Since we had to stick to appearances as British diplomats, we traveled in a luxurious compartment in which precious woods, marble, crystal glass, velvet, and leather had been artfully installed. Despite the relatively short travel time, we had comfortable beds, an illuminated desk, and running water in our rolling apartment, and still enough space. Current daily newspapers in German, French, and English were available. The train staff served coffee and tea, as well as sandwiches with salmon and shrimp. Furthermore, they paid close attention to our privacy and immediately left us alone. "How disgusting!" cried Holmes suddenly, putting his teacup on the side table next to the beds. "What inhuman cruelty!" I had to agree with him. "You are right. The waste of space and money in setting up such compartments comes at the expense of ordinary people, who have to sit tightly on hard wooden benches further back on the train." "It's not that, Watson," Holmes replied, annoyed. "I'm talking about tea. Some German dilettante brewed my Earl Grey for too long. 4 minutes, is it that difficult? Uncultured peasants." But my dear Holmes," I replied with a smile, after taking a sip of my impeccable coffee, "don't make a general judgment about the German people. After all, it has brought Kant and Hegel, Goethe and Schiller, Beethoven and Wagner forward." "Wagner?" asked Holmes, almost outraged. "Just don't remind me of this guy. If he is to act as a guarantor for the German cultural nation, then its return to barbarism is guaranteed and only a matter of time. May he simmer in his silly Valhalla." I, too, remembered our encounter with the already elderly Richard Wagner in the course of one of our first foreign cases, which had led us to Venice at that time. In fact, we couldn't say much good about him. "But how about the others?" I said. Maybe there is one or the other who is worthy," Holmes replied, "but unfortunately, Mr. Goethe is not here to prepare my tea." I let out a laugh, and Holmes seemed to have regained his humor again. "Well," he continued, "next time I'll just order beer and a Germanic drinking horn. Then there should be no problems. We should rather use the rest of the journey to prepare for the conference. I have looked through the documents, but I have found some points that I would like to discuss with you." Holmes was notoriously, not exactly, an expert in international politics and diplomacy, so I was happy to give him some facts, context, and backgrounds. I would also like to summarize these points briefly here. The German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, had been invited to Berlin for an international conference, which was commonly referred to as Congo Conference. Diplomatic delegations of the 5 major European powers, France, Germany, Russia, Austria, and of course, Great Britain, met with the more or less colonially engaged states of Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Sweden, and Denmark, as well as the Ottoman Empire, which is currently in disrepair and decay. The United States of America were also involved for the first time in this kind of conference.
The ostensible subject dealt with are freedom of trade in the African rivers, the Congo and the Niger.
But in reality, there was much more at stake, namely no less than the real division of Africa. For this purpose, spheres of interest were defined, contracts and pre-contracts were enforced on the ground, official and secret alliances were forged, military and commercial bases were established. A key issue of the conference should be the recognition of Belgian colonial ownership in the interior of the Congo Basin, on which other claims, such as the desired British North-South link, depended. France and Austria were inclined to accommodate the wishes of King Leopold, only to keep the empire in check. The same applied for the Germans, although Bismarck tried to stage himself as an honest broker. Everyone else sought the breadcrumbs or one or the other advantage as free riders, although the ambitions of the southern European states apparently went beyond that. But they lacked political, military, and financial assertiveness. The Turks were desperately trying to preserve their territories, which in many cases, in Egypt, for example, only existed on paper, and the Russians wanted above all to distract from their Transcaucasian and Central Asian ventures, as well as from their destabilization strategies in the Balkan countries. And the Americans actually had little left for Africa, but with their presence they wanted to establish themselves as global players and, in return, institutionalize the Western Hemisphere as their backyard. After all, everyone had a common interest in the unimpeded use of the Suez Canal, but this matter would be postponed to a later Congress in Constantinople. The Congo Conference was to be held the next day, on November 15th, 1884, in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin's Wilhelmsrode. It would be held until 26th of February 1885, and closed with a general file. But of course, we did not know that at the time of our arrival. The balance of power and the balance of interests at the conference were fundamentally fragile. Colonial Britain attracted a lot of displeasure. The rising Germany sometimes met with mistrust. The multi-ethnic states, Russia, Austria, and Turkey, struggled with existential questions and problems, and the smaller countries sought alliances as junior partners. Everyone was mindful of their advantage, and if one did not see one wanted to at least prevent any advantage of another. In this constellation, of course, there was also enough room for secret diplomacy and unofficial appointments, but also for conspiracy and outright sabotage. These were the underlying issues that Holmes and I arrived at. In the early evening, our train reached the train station in Berlin's Moabit district, which was the terminus. From there, we took a carriage directly to the British Embassy, which, like the conference venue, was located on Wilhelmsrode in the city center. In fact, it was only a short walk between the Reich Chancellor's palace at number 77 and Her Majesty's Embassy in the building number 70. Our ambassador, Edward Mallet, welcomed us with joy, especially as he had not seen us since the disastrous events in Brussels. He also liked our disguise, which he described as downright flawless. Then he made his way to the Palais, where a diplomatic reception was held tonight on the occasion of the conference, which would begin the next day. Holmes and I were initially brought to our accommodation by an embassy employee. Baron Linfield and Mr. Dalton had reserved a suite at the Reichshof Hotel, right next to the British Embassy at number 70A, where most of the other delegations were accommodated. We freshened up and then went to the Chancellor's palace as well. As it turned out, the diplomatic reception was a veritable social event. Distinct men from Berlin and the surrounding area had appeared for this festivity. Noble ladies and gentlemen, politicians, scientists, artists, landowners, and entrepreneurs. Bismarck did not miss the opportunity to open the event personally and on behalf of Kaiser Wilhelm. There was a lavish meal, champagne, and finally dance music from Vienna. Apparently, Congress should start with a celebration. The individual national delegations had been assigned to their own tables. Mr. Mallet inconspicuously showed us the most important people who were to discuss Africa tomorrow. I took a few notes while Holmes apparently archived everything directly in his memory. Afterwards, we mingled with the guests in order to get to know one or the other personally. The handling was formal, thoroughly polite, and all the people we introduced ourselves to as Her Majesty's delegates did not seem to notice our false identity and disguise. Since we were a little tired from the arrival, we left the celebration at about 11:30, which was still in full swing at that time. Mr. Mallet thought that nothing would happen today and dismissed us so that we would be fresh and cheerful tomorrow. However, he himself remained in the palace. After we went back to the hotel, we quickly went to bed. Our suite included 2 separate bedrooms, to which we retreated after our evening toilet. I fell asleep soon, and Holmes must have done the same. A big day was lying in way ahead of us, filled with plenty of work, which would require us to dedicate the utmost attention and concentration to. I was woken by a violent knock at the door. I got out of bed, went to the window, and pushed the curtain aside a little. It was still dark outside. When I found my pocket watch at Lichte, I realized that it was only 6 o'clock in the morning. The conference was supposed to start in the early afternoon, which meant that there was no reason for such a hurry. Nevertheless, I left my bedroom, crossed the living room, and walked to the door, which was still being knocked at. When I opened it, I was surprised. In front of me were 2 uniformed Prussian security guards with their characteristic spiked helmets. "Not again," I muttered, while Holmes also came out of his bedroom. I turned around and said, "All right, get dressed. We're probably arrested." But from outside the aisle, a deep voice rang out with the words, "That's not the case, gentlemen." And the next moment, Otto von Bismarck stood between the 2 policemen. "Forgive the early disturbance," he said. "May I enter, Lord Linfield?" Without waiting for my answer, the German Chancellor pushed me aside and made his way into our premises. "Take a seat, gentlemen," he ordered, pointing to the round table in the middle of the room. We complied with the order and sat down. Sir Bismarck himself stopped while the 2 security guards closed the door from the outside. "I wanted to talk to you openly," the Chancellor continued. "As it stands, I need your help." "Excuse me," Holmes replied calmly, "but we are not authorized to make bilateral agreements. You need to talk to our head of delegation, Mr. Mallet. We only have an advisory role." "That's what we need," Bismarck replied, unmoved. "You are counseling detective, Mr. Holmes, aren't you?" So we were actually unmasked. I got sick to my stomach and buried my face in my hands. Holmes raised an eyebrow and replied, "That's mix-up. My name is Professor George Dalton, and this is His Lordship Baron Linfield." Bismarck sighed, then put on an almost menacing look. Don't insult my intelligence, Mr. Holmes, and never underestimate the Prussian secret police. They knew that Dr. Watson and I would arrive incognito as part of the British delegation? Asked Holmes. Of course, replied the Chancellor, even before you boarded the HMS Doggerbank in London. Then I probably overestimated Her Majesty's Secret Service, Holmes said. But what is this really about? You did not need to wake us up during these ungodly hours in order to bring about a diplomatic crisis. Bismarck took a deep breath and sat down at the table. I could care less. He began in a kind of conciliatory tone. Who accompanies the various delegations in secret? We all know our spy department is superior to all competing intelligence agencies. You are right, Mr. Holmes. It is about something else. As I said, I need your help. My help as a detective? Suggested Holmes. Indeed, the Chancellor confirmed. Something has happened, presumably a crime or at least a sabotage. However, it is hardly conceivable that our police will investigate. The delegations would not accept that. But if a widely recognized detective of world fame were to take up the matter, one could count on the necessary courtesy of the diplomatic circles. So the incident relates to the conference, Holmes said. Bismarck nodded. Yes, indeed, he said slowly, and the matter therefore also needs to be handled with care. If we cannot resolve the case before the opening of the conference, we might have to cancel it. Therefore, I would ask you to take over the investigation. And if we refuse? I interjected. Well, Dr. Watson, Bismarck replied, you can also be transported to a quarry in the Ore Mountains for espionage if you prefer. We are diplomats, I protested. With false papers, the Chancellor replied. You are more like fraudsters than spies. Diplomatic conventions, therefore, do not apply to you. Before I could say anything else that would cause further predicament, Holmes took the floor again. Please, go ahead and tell us what happened. We need to know what kind of case this is. Certainly, Sir Bismarck replied. However, we don't really know for sure. It could be a kidnapping, or in the worst case, a murder. In any case, the fact is that a significant conference participant has disappeared without a trace. This spiked Holmes's interest. He laughed briefly and then said, I like that. We'll take over the case. Who disappeared? It is about Count Emmerich Szechenyi, said Bismarck, Austrian head of delegation and Imperial Royal Ambassador in Berlin. He did not return to the hotel after the gala reception. His adjutant informed us. And now the Austrians are also threatening to leave if the matter is not immediately resolved, and Count Emmerich is found or freed. The conference would fail even before it started. The Austrians? I asked, astonished. Can't you even control your own Germanic brothers? Oh, please, Germans? Shouted Bismarck, annoyed. Graf Imrich, or rather Graf Imre, comes from the Hungarian land nobility. The Viennese court probably had fun sending us a gypsy baron from the Pannonian steppes. They did this on purpose to annoy us, and now we ran into a problem. Some kind of brothers they are. I tell you honestly, I'm tired of always playing the nanny for these Austrians, who are as unreliable as they are entitled. In this case, though, it does not matter what I think. We have to find Count Emmerich. There is a lot at stake. I could hardly hide my amusement at this Germanic fraternal strife, while Holmes calmly said, I understand. So Count Emmerich took part in the ceremony in the Chancellor's palace last night. There are enough witnesses to this, and Dr. Watson and I were also taking part. Mr. Mallet introduced us, more or less briefly, to the Lord. When we left the reception, which was around 10 o'clock and 33 minutes, the Count was still there. I am absolutely certain. He was just giving a loud speech about the daring hussar exploit. Yes, of course, Lord Bismarck growled. That impertinent guy, whenever he is drunk enough, his courage rises and he tells of this supposed heroic peace from the 7 Years' War. On October 16, 1757, Austrian troops occupied Berlin for 1 day. although they were inferior in number. Count Emmerich liked to tell us that, but for us Prussians, this is an insult to our honor. But isn't that story true? I asked, knowing this military historical episode. The Austrians did not fight fair, said Bismarck, who was furious. They lack honor, especially when it comes to warfare. Outrageous. Well, I said calmly, it was probably a legitimate war deception, cleverly devised and courageously executed. In my opinion, the strategy of Field Marshal Lieutenant Haddock at that time lied in the tradition of your heroic Germanic Prince Arminius. You know, the one from the battle at Teutoburg Forest? The Chancellor interrupted me sharply. Dr. Watson, he shouted, you may have fought against camel herders in the ranks of the brave British infantry at the Hindu Kush, but your questionable military strategic considerations and historical analogies are absolutely misplaced. Therefore, I would urge you to return to the case. Of course, Holmes said immediately. Dr. Watson certainly did not want to degrade the glorious battles of the Cherkessers and Prussians. However, we want to keep in mind a possible dispute over the Hussars' prank, although I do not assume that the motive can be found here. Be that as it may, the fact is that at 11:30, Count Emmerich was still on site at the Palais. What we need to do now is reconstruct what happened in the following. Who did the Count talk to? What has been said? Who saw him last? Who wants to harm the Austrian delegation? Who is sabotaging the conference as a whole? These are the questions we have to deal with. Bismarck calmed down and replied, I am pleased to see that you are proceeding so systematically. I would suggest the following, gentlemen. Have them bring you breakfast to your room and get ready to welcome the representatives of the individual national delegations here at this table. They will answer your questions. At 7 o'clock, we want to start. Time is pressing. However, the Ottoman representative is in any case an early riser. Just one more thing. Maybe you want to dress a little more appropriately and also take off your irritating disguises. With this, the German Chancellor said goodbye for the time being and left us alone. We had just freshened up for the day. Holmes had even found time to shave and was sitting at our breakfast room when a knock on the door announced our first guest for questioning. Please, Holmes explained, just come in. At this point, I would like to briefly add that in accordance with international diplomatic practice, the French conversational language was used, except, of course, for our own British and American representatives. This language was more or less well known by the various representatives, and Holmes, of course, did not bother too much to conduct a survey in French. For the sake of simplicity and comprehensibility, however, I shall refrain from a precise reproduction of form, some colors and accents, since this does not matter. We therefore welcomed Mehmed Said Pasha, one of the most senior participants of the Berlin Conference, as the first potential witness. He was Grand Vizier and thus Prime Minister of the government of the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and in fact he was an early riser, looking fresh and cheerful in these early hours of the morning, proudly wearing an Anatolian costume. He deliberately refused the conventional dress code of European diplomacy, which also instructed to wear a frack just like the English fashion these days. Merhaba, Holmes began. I hope you didn't have to postpone your morning prayer for this conversation. I would never have done that, replied the Grand Vizier. Nothing could be so important that I neglect my duties to Allah. I understand, Holmes said, then continued. You probably already know why you're here. We are investigating the disappearance of Count Emmerich and would like to ask for your help. Said Pasha frowned. I deeply doubt that I can help you in this matter. I had nothing to do with this gentleman. You didn't see the Count at yesterday's reception? Asked Holmes. Yes, of course, replied the Grand Vizier. His vociferous speeches cannot be ignored. In addition, Count Emmerich dared to praise the advantages of the Austrian administration of Bosnia and Herzegovina, He claimed that after centuries of Ottoman subjugation, the population would now be liberated and taken out of the dark Middle Ages. An outrageous claim. I don't understand how this man can be part of the diplomatic corps. So there was an argument, said Holmes. It was more like a rebuke, Said Pasha corrected. Despite his age, the Count sometimes behaves like a child, especially when he is drunk and the devil takes control of his tongue. He was drunk, and a meaningful discussion quickly proved impossible. To avoid further insults, we stopped. The Austrians have bad manners in general. I pray that they will find God's truth. We have therefore allowed ourselves to leave a gift to the delegation. Holmes frowned. A gift? He repeated. Yes, the Grand Vizier confirmed. A precious print of the Holy Koran. May the Austrians find enlightenment in it. After all, I interjected a little thoughtlessly, this is a more subtle approach than the two-time military siege of Vienna. We fulfill the will of God, said Pasha. If God wants the Ottomans to rule over Europe, he will make it possible. At the moment, however, it seems more like, I continued, Allah favors to push the Ottomans back to the Bosphorus. The Sultan's empire has lost most of its possessions in Europe, and don't forget Egypt. The Grand Vizier lost a little of his composure. When the Balkan Congress took place here in Berlin in 1878, we were deceived. The Slavs, Greeks, and Austrians have conspired against the Sublime Porte, and the English are helping them. They occupy our country, destroy our faith, our culture, and our way of life. But the time for retreat is over. Now Holmes took over the conversation again. If I see it correctly, you have a certain resentment towards the Austrians? An attack on Count Emmerich and a failure of the conference would not be an inconvenience to you. I am not shedding tears for the Count, Said Pasha replied openly. When he is dead, it was God's will and desire for atonement for a series of iniquities. However, I can assure you, Mr. Holmes, that my delegation has nothing to do with the matter. We are diplomats, not murderers. When was the last time you saw Count Emmerich? Asked Holmes after a brief pause. We left the reception about 11:45, the Grand Vizier replied. The event was not necessary to our liking. Unbridled alcohol consumption, half-naked maids, dirt, sin, and blasphemy. At that time, Count Emmerich was sitting at a table of the French delegation and was, to say the least, alive. I understand, Holmes said, rising. We're done with the interview. Thank you for your kindness, and please forgive the harassment. Said Pasha also got up and said goodbye with a bow. Salam alaikum. Wa alaikum salam, Holmes replied, escorting our first guest to the door. When he closed it and came back to the table, he asked, Well, Watson, what do you think of it? An exotic man, I replied. There's no doubt he might have an interest in the alleged act. The political constellation in the Balkans may well give rise to a motive. I can also imagine that in the Turkish delegation there are belligerent people, janissaries, assassins, or the like, who have been trained to make a human being disappear without a trace. Certainly, Holmes replied thoughtfully, but the Grand Vizier is obviously a believing man who aspires to a life pleasing to God. It is hard to imagine that criminal acts are part of his political diplomatic repertoire. Nevertheless, we want to keep the Ottoman delegation on the list. Next, however, we should ask the representative of France to join us. A few minutes later, our second interlocutor appeared, who was again brought to us by a German official, Alphonse Caudron de Courcelles, the head of the French delegation, and at the same time also the French ambassador to Berlin. Let us come straight to the point, Holmes began the conversation. As you know, we are investigating the whereabouts of the Austrian envoy, Count Emmerich. Did you contact him yesterday? But of course, Mr. Caudron replied. He sat at our table for a while. I sincerely hope that nothing serious has happened to him, because he's a very formidable guy. What do you mean? Continued Holmes. We had a good conversation, the French ambassador said. Graf Emmerich is a friend of our red wine and an excellent connoisseur. He is also very well read. We talked about Voltaire and Rousseau. He also knows how to tell extremely amusing historical anecdotes. Do you know the story of the Berlin Hussar prank? Oh, too delicious. We're aware of that, Holmes said. How long did the Count sit at your table? Codron looked up briefly and then said, Oh, that was only 15 minutes, but Emmerich spoke like a waterfall. I must add that the wine and our cognac has loosened his tongue to some degree. He drank excessively? Asked Holmes. Oh, well, Codron replied calmly, that's a matter of opinion. We already know each other quite well, and I think Count Emmerich can take a drink or two. Was there any conflict at your table? Asked Holmes. Nothing serious, the ambassador replied. After the third glass of cognac, Count Emmerich likes to complain about the separation of Tyrol from the Austrian Empire in the course of the Revolutionary Wars, but that's just fun. I always tell him that he has to look for the responsible ones in Munich, not in Paris. And around 11 o'clock, Holmes suspected, the Count left your table. Exactly, Mr. Codron said. He got up, turned in circles, and then announced that he wanted to go poke the bear. Holmes frowned. What did he mean by that? Mr. Codron laughed briefly and then declared, he went to the table of the Russian delegation. Pyotr Alexeyevich Kapnist, a diplomat from St. Petersburg, was Russia's highest representative at the Berlin Conference. He met us in his military uniform. Holmes began the questioning quite directly by throwing his question into the room. You haven't let the Austrian head of delegation disappear, have you? Mr. Kapnist remained calm and responded with a somewhat strange counter-question. Have you found his body? No, Holmes replied. Well, replied the Russian, no corpse, no crime. Holmes involuntarily raised his right eyebrow and asked the obvious question. Should we have found a corpse? Mr. Kapnist, still having a straight face, declared, If we let someone disappear, as you put it, there is no corpse. The Okhrana works thoroughly. The unsolicited mention of the Tsarist Secret Service did not exactly promote our confidence, but Holmes didn't let on to anything and continued, As a detective as well as a chemist, I am naturally interested in the perfect crime. How would you make a body disappear without a trace? Without flinching, the Russian diplomat replied, Dissolve in hydrofluoric acid and dump it into the spree, quite simply. Gradually, I became seriously concerned about the welfare of Count Emmerich, but Holmes simply asked, And did this happen to the missing person? Mr. Kapnist raised his shoulders indifferently. I don't know. If someone did it, then at least they deserve my respect. The Count is an impertinent, sneaky man. His death would not be a loss. So of course you and your delegation have nothing to do with it? Holmes said. When was the last time you saw Count Emmerich? That was yesterday, at the reception, just after 11 a.m., the diplomat said.
The Count came to our table shaking. Obviously, he was not quite sober anymore. However, this did not prevent him from taking our Crimean sparkling wine without asking.
He stammered a few words in his miserable Russian and then tried to do the Kozachok quite embarrassingly. He was dancing? Asked Holmes, a little surprised. The Cossack dance, Mr. Kapnist confirmed. But at the second Prizyatka, he fell to the ground. And what happened after that? You probably helped him get back on his feet? Said Holmes. The head of the Russian delegation had a dark laugh. Then he said, No, this undignified spectacle was below our level. But your ambassador, Mr. Edward Mallet, rushed in and helped the Count. Backed by his shoulder, he then limped to the table of the British delegation. That's it. Nothing more has happened, and I don't have anything else to say. Soon after Kapnist had left us, Mr. Mallet appeared. He confirmed the Russian version of the events, adding, Graf Emmerich only stayed at our table for a few minutes, enough time to strengthen himself with a double scotch. He recovered from his accident quite well and thanked me for the help and then moved on to the table of the Italian delegation. It seems to me, I said, the Count made an interesting tour through the international delegations, but the fact that everyone had to offer national spirits is a strange custom. That's pretty normal, Mr. Mallet said. As a diplomat, you just need to be able to put away alcohol better than others. In any case, Holmes said, the Count may not have missed an opportunity to make himself unpopular with certain delegations. Mr. Mallet nodded. Certainly, he is known as a provocateur, but mostly it is just harmless jokes. Nevertheless, there are, of course, real political conflicts underlining it. In the Balkans, the Austrians are fighting with the Ottomans and the Russians for supremacy. It is all about access to the Mediterranean, and ultimately, of course, also about the control of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. But we are also playing a role in it, at least indirectly. I muttered more to myself, apparently we already have more suspects than we need, and we're not even through with all the delegations. Mr. Mallet stood up and said, Right, Dr. Watson, it's confusing, and there are various possibilities, but it would be very important to resolve this case. After your camouflage has blown up, we have a duty to the Germans. Make an effort, hurry up. There is a lot at stake for the Empire as well. With these words, our ambassador left us to return to his affairs. After all, the Congo Conference was to be opened in just a few hours. Eduardo Dulani represented the interests of the Kingdom of Italy in Berlin. He was an experienced, slightly older diplomat with white hair, and he as well had his gripes with his Austrian colleagues. Graf Emmerich came to our table about 15 minutes after 11, he said, apparently with the sole aim of drinking our grappa and making bizarre threats of war. War threats? Asked Holmes. That seems a bit rabid to me. Indeed, Mr. Launay said. However, the Count was certain that the Austrian army would soon retake the Veneto region. He also accused us of disbanding the Papal State and holding the Pope hostage. And above all, he said that Garibaldi was more of a street robber than a freedom fighter. Imagine that. I understand, Holmes said. And how did you react to that? I'm not going to be offended by this guy, shouted Launay indignantly. So I announced that our troops would annihilate the Imperial Royal Army in no time, and Italy would occupy Trentino as far as the main ridge of the Alps, Istria, and Dalmatia. But that is not exactly diplomatic restraint, Holmes said, smiling. Our rise is not over, Mr. Launay replied. The Roman Empire will rise again and rule over the world. Faced with this exaggeration, I could not hold back and said, Please inform the British government when the time comes. We will, of course, then retreat behind Hadrian's Wall and leave the ancestral British province to your legionnaires. Before the head of delegation could respond, Holmes punished me with a serious look and said, Excuse the English humor, Your Excellence. It's not always understandable to outsiders. Well, Mr. Launay replied, I probably got a little too much into it. That is the fault of Count Emmerich. He really gets under one's skin and doesn't make it easy for one to keep their composure. So there was a crosstalk, Holmes continued, a dispute, including military threats, and what happened then? What do you think? Said Launay, smiling. The same thing that always happens. After all, we are diplomats. We reconciled ourselves with a glass of Chianti. That's all? Said Holmes. Yes, the Italian envoy confirmed. The Count said goodbye exuberantly by kissing me on both cheeks without asking, and then he went on to the table of the Swedish delegation. By that time, it was certainly already 12:30. The United Kingdom of Sweden and Norway was represented at the conference by Baron Gillis Bildt, who was also the ambassador in Berlin and a routine parliamentarian, officer, and diplomat from Gothenburg. It does not surprise me that Count Emmerich got into trouble, he said at the beginning of our conversation. I think he's got a special, dubious talent for that. Nevertheless, we hope that he will be found safe. If my information is correct, you talked to him at an advanced hour yesterday? Holmes stated. Yes, it was close to midnight, Lord Bilt replied. When the Count came to our table, he was noticeably drunk, but nevertheless insisted on trying our aquavit. Then everything took a strange turn. "What happened?" asked Holmes. Lord Bilt took a deep breath. The Count sat down next to my wife and engaged her in a rather intrusive conversation, highly inappropriate behavior. "He made advances to her in front of you," said Holmes. "Yes," Lord Bilt confirmed. "We had to politely ask him to leave our table." "Politely?" Holmes repeated with a questioning expression. "Honestly," the Swedish ambassador continued, "the Count refused to leave. My staff had to carry him away while he was sitting on his chair. Of course, he tried to protest and engaged in fisticuffs, but fortunately it was nothing too serious." "And what happened then?" asked Holmes. "Then an American delegate approached us," Lord Bilt replied. "He had observed the situation and wanted to deal with the Count. He said that he was not going to bother us any longer, and that is what happened. I haven't seen Count Emmerich ever since, and I assumed that he left the Chancellor's palace after our encounter." Holmes's ear perked up. "An American delegate?" he shouted. "Who was it?" "You may have heard of him," Lord Bilt said. "It was the famous explorer Henry Morgan Stanley." "Oh, yes, we know him more than we would like," I said with a sigh and threw a glance at Holmes. When we were alone again, we tried to resume on what we have found out so far. "If Lord Bilt is right," I began, "and Count Emmerich actually left the reception at midnight, but never arrived at the hotel, then anything could have happened. Outside on the street, someone might have lurked, overpowered him, or immediately put him down, depending on whether it was a political assassination or just a small personal robbery. The list of potential perpetrators is also quite long, with the Turks, the Russians, the Italians, or the Swedes having motives. In any case, it is also possible that he left a negative impression on the Danes, the Belgians, Dutch, Spaniards, or the Portuguese. Anyways, it's only a few steps from the Chancellor's palace here to the Reichshof," Holmes replied. "This gives little time and space on a street that is busy at all times, even later in the hour, to kidnap or kill a man and hide the body. We also need to consider other possibilities. Sooner or later, my dear Watson, we are going to have to question Mr. Stanley, even if he is not exactly our closest friend. Apparently, he was the last one who definitely had contact with Count Emmerich. From the guest list that the reception had given us, at Bismarck's instruction, we gathered that Stanley also stayed here in the Hotel Reichshof. We quickly decided to leave our suite so as not to invite Mr. Stanley over, and by giving him time to prepare, but to visit him directly. When we arrived on the third floor, we knocked on the door with the number 205 a few minutes later. On the inside, we could hear steps, and after a few seconds, Stanley opened the door for us. He stood in front of us in his morning coat and actually seemed surprised to see us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he exclaimed with astonishment. "What are you two doing here in Berlin?" I noted, and that kind of satisfied me, that at least the American Foreign Intelligence Service was not as well informed as the Prussian secret police. "Good morning, Mr. Stanley," Holmes replied. "We are here on behalf of Reich Chancellor Bismarck. May we enter?" But Stanley demonstratively blocked our way into his room. "May I know what this is all about?" he asked. "We are investigating the disappearance of Count Emmerich, head of the delegation of Austria-Hungary," Holmes said. "We were told that yesterday you were the last person to speak to him at the reception." "Count Emmerich is gone," said Stanley, astonished, and once again seemed quite credible. "Well, yes, I actually spoke to him briefly yesterday, that's true, immediately after the discussion with the Swedish delegation." Holmes nodded. "We know about it. What were you talking about?" Stanley hesitated for a moment, then he reiterated. "First of all, I had to calm the Count, because he wanted to ask the Swedish ambassador for a duel. I managed to stop this absurdity. We sat down at the table of our delegation. I gave him a glass of bourbon. Mr. Emmerich calmed down and started circling around again. Then he asked me where one could really have fun in Berlin. because this celebration was only for pompous, entitled people and rigid old people. What did the Count mean by really amuse? Said Holmes. He had already drunk enough. Once again, Mr. Stanley hesitated. Then he said, "You have to know, this is a bit of a frivolous question. The Count demanded company, female company, at that." Holmes gave him a puzzled look, so I made the appropriate guess. "He was looking for a certain kind of love, if I understand you correctly?" "That's the way it is," Stanley said. "He wanted to go to a brothel." My respect for the Count sunk further, but I quickly refocused on the essentials. "And what did you say to him?" I asked. "What do you think of me?" shouted Mr. Stanley indignantly. "I'm not a pimp." "You know best who you are, Mr. Stanley," I replied, "and I trust you are capable of pretty much everything, so out with it." Mr. Stanley took a deep breath and then said, "All right, gentlemen, I think I owe you anyways." Admittedly, I gave the Count an address behind the train station on Alexanderplatz. It's an establishment for lords of upper society called To the Blue Angel. "I understand," muttered Holmes. "And Count Emmerich went there?" "That's to be assumed," Mr. Stanley replied. Shortly after midnight, he said goodbye and left the celebration. Holmes and I looked at each other. We knew that we had to go to Alexanderplatz as soon as possible. However, before we left, there was something else we had to do. "Thank you for the information, Mr. Stanley," I said. "No worries," he replied. "By the way, I'm happy to see you both healthy and enjoying your freedom. I would never have forgiven myself if something had happened to you in Brussels. You betrayed us to the police and left us to our fate in a Belgian dungeon," I replied sharply. "You will understand that if you allow, we are still a little miffed about that," I said. "You can't take that personally, Dr. Watson," Mr. Stanley replied calmly. "It was all about business." "About business?" I asked aloud. "Well, then it's time to settle the open bill." And that's when I punched Stanley in the face. "Now we're even," I said, turning around and quickly walking toward the stairs. I didn't let it be noted that my fist was now causing me severe pain. Holmes followed me after a second while Mr. Stanley, once again honestly surprised, sat with a bleeding nose under the doorframe. Bismarck had instructed the Berlin police president Guido of Madai to provide us with support during this investigation. Therefore, we went to Alexanderplatz in one of the comfortable officers' carriages, which were provided for us in front of the hotel. It was now 10 o'clock in the morning, and the streets of Berlin were buzzing. Nevertheless, we made rapid progress and soon stood in front of the Blue Angel. Apparently, the establishment was now closed, but Holmes hammered the frosted glass door loudly. "Aufmachen, Polizei!" he shouted in almost accent-free German. After a minute, a young man, apparently busy with cleanup work in the locality, finally opened. "Was gibt es denn?" he asked, visibly tired after what was supposed to be a sleepless night. "Wir haben geschlossen." "Guten Tag," Holmes said and continued without hesitation. "We are investigating on behalf of the Reich." He then pulled a portrait photo of Count Emmerich from his pocket and presented it to the man. "We are looking for this gentleman. He is said to have been in their premises during the previous night." The man looked at the picture and quickly replied, "Oh, yes, this is the crazy Hungarian. Yes, Mr. Inspector, he was here, but not for long." "Not for long?" repeated Holmes, raising an eyebrow. "If I remember correctly," the young man explained, "then he turned up around 1 o'clock. He spent money like water, donated sparkling wine to the ladies, and pretended to be a Hungarian count. But then it got weird. On the toilet, he must have suddenly had some kind of enlightenment. When he returned, he abruptly pretended to be a devout Catholic and insulted us as sinners. Finally, we had to put him outside for fresh air. After all, we cannot use sermons of this kind. That must have been around 2 o'clock. "I understand," Holmes said. "Thank you for your cooperation." The man disappeared again behind the locked door. Holmes walked in a circle and then pointed toward the city center. "The Count must have taken this path," he said. He was obviously still drunk, but at least sober enough to regain most of his morality. He certainly walked his walk of shame back home. Maybe something happened to him, I guess. Someone from the brothel may have followed him and saw that the Count was carrying a lot of cash. It seems to me, Holmes replied. I saw a small security room on the other side of the train station. Perhaps we should ask if there are any special events last night? Although it seemed unlikely to me that we would actually get any information about Count Emmerich's whereabouts. Less than 5 minutes later, we entered the little room of the Berlin police on Alexanderplatz. The officer on duty received us with the words, "Good morning, gentlemen. What can I do for you?" "Good morning," Holmes replied. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. I am a consultant detective, and this is my collaborator, Dr. John Watson." We waited 3 or 4 seconds, but the police officer seemed to have never heard from us and did not respond. When Holmes made this clear, he continued, "We are investigating a missing persons case on behalf of the Reich Chancellor." Suddenly, the security guard laughed out loud, and I'm the cat's whiskers. Oh, let's be honest, gentlemen, the famous Sherlock Holmes in Berlin, and then also on behalf of Bismarck himself. You can tell this silly story to your grandmother. Holmes also began to laugh, but after a few seconds he suddenly became serious again. Then he pulled Bismarck's recommendation letter out of his pocket and put it on the counter. The officer took a look at it and froze. Excuse me, gentlemen," he stammered. I was completely oblivious." "It's okay," Holmes interrupted him, and once again he drew the photograph of Count Emmerich and presented it to the policeman. "We are looking for this gentleman." Immediately, the officer slapped his flat hand on his forehead. "I know him." "Did you see him?" Holmes asked. "Seen?" the policeman said. "He's here at the station. Follow me." Holmes and I threw confused glances at each other. Then we followed the officer, who stormed into the back of the building. He stopped in front of a prison cell. "Here, see for yourself," he said, a little out of breath. On the platform in the cell laid a man in a frack, the clothes dirty and partially torn, the hair torn. He didn't move and stank terribly. "We're too late," I slowly said. "He's dead." "But no," replied the security guard. "He's just sleeping off a long night and too much booze." "He is sleeping it off?" I asked incredulously. "Of course," the officer replied. "The guy drank quite a lot yesterday." "And how did he get here, if I may ask?" asked Holmes. The policeman hesitated briefly, then reported, "A colleague arrested the gentleman in the street yesterday when he relieved himself publicly." I had to laugh. Hard to believe, Count Emmerich was in police custody for all this time for urinating in the street. "Oh, not just on the street," the policeman said. "He polluted the monument of Frederick the Great, a monstrosity that we could not leave unpunished. However, the delinquent has not been really responsive. What are we going to do with him now?" Holmes smiled privately and replied, "You won't believe it, but your inmate is a senior Austrian diplomat. If you will allow, we will now take him back to the Reichskanzler Palais, where Lord Bismarck is certainly waiting impatiently for his arrival." We had our police car driven to the front of the station, and the officer and I carried the largely unconscious Count from the cell to the outside, where we loaded him into the back seat. On our way back, the only thing we heard from him was an occasional moan or individual words in Hungarian. Back at our hotel in Wilhelmstrasse, we decided to bring Count Emmerich to our hotel room and then send for Bismarck. It was almost noon when the Chancellor appeared in our suite, only 2 hours before the scheduled opening of the conference. Count Emmerich was still sleeping on our sofa in our loggia, and gave at least clear signs of being still alive by snoring loudly. Bismarck even tried to smile kindly as he stepped in. "Congratulations, gentlemen. I have heard that you resolved the case and returned the Austrian ambassador safely. Where is he? I want to see him." Holmes pointed with a nod to the couch that stood behind us on the wall. whereupon Bismarck flinched when he saw him. "He is all right, yes?" he asked. "I have examined the Count thoroughly," I replied, "and he is currently undergoing mild alcohol poisoning. Other than that, a few bruises and scratches, which are likely caused by the Swedish delegation, a brothel owner, and the Berlin police." Bismarck approached the sleeping Count and said, "He looks awful, and he stinks. He is not presentable to the public in that state." "Indeed," I replied immediately. "For this, Count Emmeric's body is too weakened. He can hardly stand on his feet. He also still has a significant amount of residual alcohol in his blood." "You think," the Chancellor asked, "the guy is still drunk?" "Somehow, yes," I confirmed. "Perception, thinking, and motor skills will remain impaired for even longer." Bismarck pinched his eyes and said, "Hogwash! Wake him up." "I can't recommend that for medical reasons," I replied. "Dr. Watson," the Chancellor commanded, "there's more at stake here. Wake up the Count, or should I do it?" I went to my patient and held a bottle under his nose. "Wake up," I said as softly as possible. But Bismarck lacked patience. He stepped in and slapped the Count on his left and right cheek. "Wake up, Emmerich," he shouted, repeating the process. In fact, the Count woke up, briefly grabbed his aching cheeks, rubbed his eyes, and then discovered the Reich Chancellor bent over him. Immediately he began to smile and speak with a singing undertone. "Otto, you miserable crook, you're here too. Oh, how beautiful. We should celebrate." Then the Count turned to me and shouted, "Waiter, another bottle of Veltliner for me and my old Prussian friend." "We are not friends," Bismarck tried to teach the Count, but he began to hum the Radetzky March of the elder Johann Strauss. "Stop doing that immediately." The Chancellor continued his order. "Get up, for God's sakes. You are, after all, a representative of the Emperor of Austria and the Apostolic King of Hungary. You must now prepare for the start of the conference." Count Emmerich stopped buzzing and looked at Bismarck with a serious face. "Oh, I don't want to," he said and began to laugh. "Where is the wine?" I pulled Bismarck aside and whispered to him, "You see, Count Emmerich is not in a position to attend the conference." The Chancellor went to the table and dropped himself on a chair. "What a disgrace," he lamented. "Why do these Austrians always have to embarrass me so much? Drinking, singing, and joking, that's all they're capable of. How are we supposed to carry out decent international politics like that?" "I'm sure," I tried to reassure Bismarck, "that on the second day of the conference the patient will be back on his feet and completely back to his senses." "But that's too late," the Chancellor shouted desperately. "If the head of delegation does not attend the opening ceremony, this will not go unnoticed. There could be rumors and scandals. Imagine the press learning what the Count did last night. The whole conference could fail. Oh, if only the Count had a sober twin brother." Holmes had been at some distance, seemingly uninvolved, but then he came to the table, looked at the Count who had fallen asleep again, and then closely inspected my face. Eventually he said, "I might know a solution." I had a nasty clue and made a defensive hand movement. "No, Holmes, no, don't even think about it." But Bismarck had already understood. He jumped up and approached me a few inches and looked me in the face. "Astonishing," he said. "There is a fundamental similarity. Mr. Holmes, you are an expert in masquerade and disguises. Do you really think it is possible to turn Dr. Watson into a Hungarian count? I mean, this Hungarian count?" Holmes smiled confidently. "Of course. The original lies on the sofa. All I need is some color, rubber, wax, glue, beard hair, and wig parts that I can put together. The Hungarian clothing will certainly be made available to us by the Austrian delegation." The German Chancellor finally regained hope. "Wonderful," he shouted. "You are our salvation again. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. And also thank you, Dr. Watson, for making yourself available. We have only 2 hours, so let's go." I sat down. because I knew that trying to resist was pointless. In fact, Holmes managed to form an astonishing image of Count Emmerich out of my face. And so, at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I entered the large ballroom of the Chancellor's palace at the head of the Austrian delegation as the supposed Count Emmerich. No one was suspicious. On the contrary, the French colleague waved to me joyfully. The Turkish Grand Vizier ruffled his nose, and the wife of the Swedish ambassador winked at me. Otto von Bismarck was able to officially open the Congo Conference without delay and without further complications. It was a lengthy ceremony, with diplomatic and political speeches. When it finally came to an end, the Austrian delegation quickly withdrew in order to prepare for the tasks ahead in the coming days. At these, the real Count Emmerich was able to take place. In the meantime, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gustav Kolnacki, had sent a telegram from Vienna, which contained a sharp rebuke for the Count. In fact, the Austrian ambassador of Berlin subsequently moderated his alcohol consumption and contributed responsively to the success of the conference. For Holmes and me, however, it was no longer possible to participate in the conference, as it had been planned with the framework of the British delegation. We had lost our camouflage, and despite our successful work in the search for Count Emmerich, Bismarck politely asked us to immediately depart from Germany, a request that, at least I, was all too happy to respond to.